So shall we start with the Hail Mary?
Yes.
Yes.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.
Lord is
Blessed
with
art
thee,
thou among women,
blessed art
blessed
thou
is the
among
fruit of thy womb,
Holy
Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners
now.
now, at the hour of our death. Amen.
Okay, so someone was asking yesterday, this book of Man's Search for Meaning, so you're getting it back the front, unfortunately. This is one of Viktor Frankl. This is the book I've been referring to quite a bit, so yeah, that's very highly recommended. The other book, I'm going to send you a reading straight after class today from this book, which is Edward's 3, Men, Women and the Mystery of Love. I don't know if you've heard of this book or heard of Edward's 3. It's good. It's called Practical Insights from John Paul II's Love and Responsibility. So there's a chapter there which I think is interesting for talking about freedom and wholeheartedness. So I'll send you that this afternoon. It's very easy to read. It's quite straightforward. So okay, so today I wanted to move on to talking about freedom in the teachings of Saint Josemaria. So we're looking here at the second section. So freedom, the basis for living as a child of God. So what I want to cover first of all is some background and context for our father's writings. Then look at a couple of key notions in his understanding of freedom. And then probably tomorrow, depends how we go for time, we'll move on to look at the question of grace and freedom and how they work together. And freedom and divine filiation, which I think is kind of like the core of the topic. But we might cover a bit of that today as well. So, talk about the teachings of Saint Josemaria. His teachings on freedom, what are they based on? I'd say they're based on the charism that he received from God. You know, he received a particular spirit to be the founder of Opus Dei. But his teaching was also very much founded first and foremost on the teachings of the church. So meditating on scripture, the writings of the fathers of the church, and the teachings of the magisterium on the subject of freedom. And he was especially influenced by two doctors of the church. So first of all, St. Augustine, who wrote a lot on freedom, and also St. Thomas Aquinas. I know that the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas are still recommended by the church, for study, particularly in all the seminaries and things that people have encouraged to have a very good understanding of the teaching of St. Thomas. The magisterium of the church, particularly freedom, I suppose, begins to come into that as a focus really at the end of the 19th century, with Pope Leo XIII, which is the beginning of writing, for instance, on the social doctrine of the church, beginning of social encyclicals. So that sort of is quite recent for our father. In the 1930s, for instance, or 1928, that was still fairly new. So our father's teachings on freedom are faithful to what is contained in traditional Catholic doctrine. So the key aspects of that are, first of all, that faith is a gift. Faith is a gift from God, which we possess because we have a spiritual soul. So when we have that spiritual soul, we have those faculties of intellect and will, which enable us to know something and to choose it, to direct ourselves towards our end. The second point, that this gift is given with a purpose. And that's one of those things I think that we have lost track of as a culture today. The idea of freedom having a purpose, which is to be united with God in love. So to really work in the world, to affect the world, bring it back to Christ, and ourselves, to be united with our Lord. The third point is that our freedom is wounded by original sin. So, that our freedom, we can become slaves to sin, if you like, or we still have this inclination to sin. So sometimes we might have something very clear in our mind as to what we should do, but there's a real struggle with our inclinations. We can be inclined to evil. But this freedom, fourthly, is redeemed in Christ. It's redeemed in Christ. So, when he died on the cross, he got that gift of the Holy Spirit for us. So we're born into the supernatural life. And one of the things you see in the writings of our father is he always talks about Christian freedom. And I don't know, I think when I used to read it in the past, I was a bit like, why does he say Christian freedom? Like, freedom's freedom. If you're a Christian or not, you're free. And it's true, everybody's free. But what's radically different is when we have this freedom in the supernatural life. That supernatural life of grace is something we can't gain access to on our own. And that's a whole new level of freedom a whole new level that we're able to operate at that we wouldn't otherwise be. So this Christian freedom is the freedom of the children of God. So the last point is then that we live with this freedom that Christ wanted for us, so we can be children of God. Okay. Does that make sense? No, none of that comes as a surprise, I'm guessing. Here's the basic doctrine. Okay, so what I look a little bit at is, there's 2 points, I suppose, that come out really for our Father and his teaching. So one of them is this awareness of divine filiation. Okay, so for him, freedom is important because we love. So he says, like, freedom and love for St. Josemaria, are like two sides of the same coin. So, the reason that the purpose of freedom is love. So for him, without love, without freedom, we can't love. Okay? So that's why it's so important, and he loved freedom so much. And one thing we'll see is this great optimism and positive approach towards freedom in the writings of our Father, which wasn't necessarily a feature of his time. And that's perhaps also why our Father had this spirit of really supporting and encouraging personal initiative, of a bit of people being able to use their freedom, taking responsibility in their ordinary activities and those things, their evangelism. So his love for freedom relates to two other central elements in his teaching. So the first is the awareness of divine filiation. So when we really have a good understanding of freedom, that helps us to appreciate the richness of our divine filiation, what it is that God has given us and how we can unite ourselves to God. And then the other way around, when we really become aware of our divine filiation, that gives us a real insight into our freedom. What it really means to be a child of God and to be free. And the second point is the sanctification of ordinary work, which for St. Josemaria, that charism he was given, was about being able to exercise our freedom in the middle of the world as part of our lay secularity. So I don't know if you've seen that. I put last night a link to the trailer, There Be Dragons, just in case you haven't seen it. But there's a part where St. Josemaria goes to see the bishop, and he's kind of explaining the idea of lay people seeking holiness and their ordinary activities. And the bishop says, that seeking holiness without being in holy orders, that sounds rather Protestant. Like, it's totally unfamiliar, this idea. Of course, now after Vatican II, we understand the vocation of the laity much more clearly. I suppose there's a lot more insight after the Second Vatican Council. But that was something very radical at his time. So St. Josemaria reminded his children, he reminds us to use our freedom responsibly. When he says these world crises are crises of saints, that we use our freedom to get involved, and to really try to promote the common good, the truth, bring souls back to God. And so using our freedom and our responsibility. Am I going too fast? Am I talking too fast? Because I know I tend to get faster and faster when I get worked up. Okay, so if we look at the sources, a bit of the context and historical background of St. Josemaria. So I don't know if you've seen this photo of St. Josemaria before. It's from his times in the seminary. This is a close-up. There's a whole, but when you look at the photo, he's actually the only one smiling. It's a very serious photo, like of the time. That's how people dress. He's very young, so he was ordained when he was like 23. So he's obviously very young in this photo. But his message, to say, we know that he was born in 1902, beginning of the 20th century. I think, what are some of the sources, perhaps, for his understanding of freedom? Okay, so obviously the charism, he has the teachings of the church, the charism he receives from God as the founder of Opus Dei. But he also is within this context of the early 20th century. And his approach is quite unique, within this context. Okay? Although the spirit really he's teaching is as old as the gospel. So some of the influences, I think you could say, well, first of all, his family, the way he was brought up. And he says his parents gave him a lot of freedom and a lot of trust, but not very much money. So he could do a lot of things, but he couldn't go too far, I suppose. But there was that environment he had in his home of a lot of trust and freedom. So there's there's the story when he was small, he was hiding under the bed because he'd have to go on visits when all the aunts came around. He'd have to go and kiss them all, and he'd get really embarrassed, And then he said they had bristly chins and didn't like that, so he'd hide under the bed. And his mother sort of came and got him out, fished him out with a stick, and said to him, you know, only ever be ashamed of sinning. This is that real sense of freedom. No, only be ashamed of sinning. The fathers of the church, this is an image of St. Augustine, so reading the fathers of the church, and he knew the fathers of the church so well. You know? And then the scriptures. So the fathers of the church, the scriptures, and the liturgy. And he drew on these sources so much, you know, in his interior life. Some other things that are important in this period is the historical and political context. So this was a period when totalitarianism was really being established. So you had communism happening in Russia, the Russian Revolution in 1917, I think, the rise of the National Socialists of Hitler in Germany, and those totalitarian regimes that really repressed freedom. And they clashed in the Spanish Civil War before the Second World War. And so St. Josemaria lived through the Spanish Civil War, and again, that's part of what you see in There Be Dragons. But there are times where you were really having to take sides, one side or another. There was a lot of political tension. And one of the things that St. Josemaria used to do was to encourage them to be open to everybody. You know? So sometimes they would find themselves in prison, say one side or the other would lock them up. And he'd encourage them, you know, when you play soccer, don't play on political lines. mix up the teams between you, you know, so to foster that openness and that understanding. So that's happening. We've got the Enlightenment, which is sort of, I suppose you can talk about the totalitarian regimes which impose, you know, they restrict your freedom from the outside. You can't do these things. You have to think this, you know, you're not allowed to do that. And then on the other side, there were movements, I suppose, that went the opposite direction into licentiousness. You know, everything is up to, you know, to myself and my own understanding. So liberalism as a philosophical movement in the 19th century was the one that classically said the role of government protect individual freedom. Okay? And apart from that, it shouldn't butt into anything. It shouldn't tell us anything that we have to do except promote freedoms or protect freedoms. So, you know, really, again, that was quite linked with a utilitarian philosophy, which again was the one that said, unless it's hurting somebody else, you know, then you shouldn't really have a role. The state shouldn't get involved in telling someone they can or cannot do something unless it affects someone else. The Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was an earlier movement, but it was the one that tried to re-establish an idea of morality without God. Okay, so it was kind of saying, well, you know, as we get to know more and more things and the rise of science and wisdom, bit by bit, we will know how to explain everything and we won't need God anymore. Won't need God. So we can work out our own moral codes for ourselves. You know, and what was important, so for instance, for Immanuel Kant, an Enlightenment philosopher, was that you make the law for yourself in a way. Like you work out what the right thing to do is and you do it, you know, which in a way is good, but we'll go in the future a little bit into where that goes wrong. Okay. There's also modernism, which was a movement in the church, which I suppose was part of that watering down the authority of the church, and the clarity around right and wrong, and those things. So, you know, these movements kind of were the ones that started to erode the idea of freedom from within, from the outside. Okay, so St. Josemaria rejected both of those extremes. Okay, so his idea was to try to promote genuine freedom. So what I want to talk about next part of this context is voluntarism, or duty and obedience, okay, because this is an approach to how people really generally understood freedom at the time of St. Josemaria when he was living. So anyone know what voluntarism is? You have a attempt to explaining voluntarism?
Trying to do everything with your own strength without God.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Exactly. So voluntas means will in Latin. So essentially the essence of voluntarism is trying to do everything on willpower. So that something is free if it's coming from my will. Mm-hmm. And also that the only thing that's really important for freedom is the willpower. Okay, so that's all you need for something to be free. So this idea is really important in understanding freedom. If you think, what have we actually got? We have the intellect, we have the will, and we have the passions, you know, or the heart in a way. So, you know, the intellect is really important. you need to have that, we need the three of them to be involved for a full understanding of freedom. Okay? So what happened over time is the development of this train of thought where freedom was about will alone. So it sort of denied a role, particularly for reason or for the emotions. So we could say that voluntarism says that freedom is achieved by willpower alone. Okay? And that it's about doing something because it's your duty. So I had a couple of questions here, and what I thought I'm going to attempt to do is do some little breakout rooms, little discussion rooms, so we can see if this works or not. But I thought I'd give you some time so you can talk about these questions or other things that come up. So I mean, one of the questions I'm interested in thinking through this course is, what are some of the challenges for freedom that you see today, particularly in the education of children? What are some of the challenges they face in learning how to live their freedom well? So are the questions I've got here clear? Like this idea of voluntarism, of working on willpower, what are the positives? When you know what the right, when you do the right thing because it's your duty, because you've decided that's what you're going to do. Are there any negatives or limitations to this approach, for freedom? What are some of the implications of it? And then how does it affect educating children? If you're going to go about educating children to learn how to live freely, what would be some of the implications of this if they pick up a voluntaristic sort of approach to living? Alrighty, so now we're going to breakout rooms. If we have a look at the question that we looked at here, does someone from one of the groups want to give a bit of what responses you had, and overall whether you thought it was positive or negative?
Yeah, no, look, we just in terms of, I mean, I hope we answered it the right way, but with moral voluntarism, some of the positives are that some people have a really clear, fast, way of making decisions, and they can carry them out. They sort of don't get distracted. But it can be just out of duty, as you say, it is duty, whereas it might be missing that sort of love and that sort of nuanced sort of taking other things into consideration. So one of the negatives is that people who might, moral voluntarism might, instead of people doing duty out of love, they can form a resentment towards their duty. Because it's a burden to them, they're missing that other side of it. With the implications for action and for the interior life, we didn't cover it terribly thoroughly, maybe. Somebody else might like to chime in. But, we can do things out of routine and we carry on, like, doing it at your prayer time, even though there's somebody knocking on the door that might be really needing help, but I'm going to finish this regardless. We're sort of going to push through and not take the external considerations external matters into consideration, maybe the needs of the family, doing your prayer when you should be cooking the dinner. I don't know what some of the examples might be. If you develop that routine and it's not, and you just, you're a bit like a robot, I said, really. When we looked at children, the education of children in freedom, we had quite a discussion on that because it's one that's hard, but it affects us all, especially as our children grow up, that they've got to learn to make decisions. If we've sort of tried to be too narrow and, sort of teaching them out of duty and you do it this way, I don't know, maybe we took the wrong track, but they're not going to own their own decisions and they've got to learn to deal with the consequences of their own decisions, and they've got to be allowed to make mistakes. I think someone quoted Marie Therese by saying that she used to say, you give them a wide playing field, but show them the boundaries. So, anyway, that's our contribution.
Thank you. Pretty thorough. Yeah. Cheryl, in your group? Yeah.
I think we did much the same as what Mary Louise was talking about, that we could do it as a robot, as duty. We run out of steam, that sometimes we might even be doing it just because of the respect of our friends or whatever. And we were looking at the challenges of having masses online, how that example that we're giving our children is so important, that they see that we're doing it out of love and not out of duty.
Yeah. It's a really good example, actually. There's a whole change in how things are done right now. Yeah. Anyone else want to contribute something from their group?
I think you said a really good thing, Nora, about doing it out of love. Otherwise, like you can lose steam after if you're just doing it out of duty. And also the change in circumstances can affect you. Whereas if you're doing it out of love, the change in circumstances won't. Like your duty will change with your change of circumstances, but if you're doing things out of love, you will adapt to the different circumstances.
You find ways, I suppose.
Yeah. And also that, just the whole thing of that willpower. You can't go on willpower alone. And we're talking about, I think Tamara said something about like depending on your culture, bringing up children, you might, it might be very focused more on duty. And then the children might resent that over time, whereas they need to be given a certain amount of freedom. And then I think Melissa said something about the freedom was different for the different age groups. So if you're, obviously you only give a certain amount of freedom to a toddler and you give more freedom to a teenager, and obviously it goes up as they get older. Just so they can learn how
to they can exercise it.
And yes, yes, and learn how to use it with responsibility. Yeah.
And I think someone mentioned before consequences that you do learn. I think it's how people don't talk about so much helicopter parenting anymore, but lawnmower parenting. You heard about lawnmower parenting? Like when you go ahead with the kid with the lawnmower, basically making sure all the grass is the right length and smooth, and so they don't have to. So the path is just clear all the way.
Yeah.
And that I suppose sometimes you want things to go well. You want things to go well for your kids. You want them to succeed, all of that. But sometimes learning about failure is really important part of maturing, and learning how to use freedom, to learning about consequences, those sorts of things. I suppose that's part of the wisdom, I suppose, of parenting, to know how to do that at the right level for the right child. Because each child, again, has their own personality. Someone told me they went to a key parent function at Redfield once, and the psychologist, and he just said, keep them alive to 25, like basically for boys. Sort of like, if you do that, you've done a good job. But for other kids, perhaps you need to do a bit more work on it. Okay, does anyone else have something they'd like to say, to contribute? Yes.
Oh, yes. No, it was just something that Nor pointed out as well, and that is the need to teach them responsibility along with their freedom.
So why is that important? I don't disagree with you.
The consequences of just exerting their sense of freedom without realizing consequences and the responsibility that it entails could lead to just self-will and also a lot of serious danger to themselves.
Sorry, Marina, can you give an example of that? How do you see that? How does that look?
How does what look? Showing them
freedom with responsibility.
Well, it was Nora's point. We should put her onto it. But to my way of thinking, just when they're little, you're giving them the boundaries around that. A bit like what Marie Therese is reported to have said, that they actually know what the boundaries are of their freedom. I suppose explaining what would happen if they didn't do that is something that you would do as time progressed, as they got older. But there's a lot of talk about boundaries. Well, that's a really good idea, letting them know those things, because that does equate to letting them know what the responsibilities are in the exercise of their freedom.
I suppose if you don't learn about responsibility, everything is always going to be someone else's fault as well. When things don't work out, when you don't get the consequence you want.
So letting them make the decision, but saying, you know, whatever happens, that's up to you to deal with. I'm talking about older children as opposed to.
I don't think it hurts them to hear often enough when they're going on about, I shouldn't have to do this and I shouldn't have to do that. Just that thing, yes, you should. It's your responsibility. Just so that it underpins. It's the same with a good sense of duty. You know, to duty, it's your responsibility. But they need to know, of course, that we're saying those things out of love, and that we give example in that ourselves, that we fulfill our responsibilities and so on.
I suppose it's little things. Is it like, you know, you forget your homework? Is your mum going to come up with your lunch and your sports clothes and your homework every single time you forget something? You know, or you have to take the consequences.
A whole lot of it do.
So, you know, every now and then you might get bailed out, but sometimes you learn once you have to actually walk home or something, or get a detention, something like that. Yeah. And I suppose with the bigger decisions, so okay, in the end, with the older kids, you make your decision and there are consequences, but you are still there. You know what I mean? It's not kind of just letting them sink. That perhaps you're there to talk it through, to help them work out how they can fix, you know, or reclaim something from what they've done. If they don't have the maturity yet to work that out themselves.
Giving them the tools, I guess, but not getting on the phone or doing the work for them.
Yeah.
Get them out.
Yeah, not doing the work for them, you know.
But maybe guiding them as to how they're going to get. I find some need more discussion about, like, they get overwhelmed with the amount of work they've got to do, and then you just need to discuss, okay, what do you need to do, when you're going to do it, and just kind of guiding them like that, rather than, so that they don't get overwhelmed to the point that they freeze. I've got a few like that.
Sometimes to teach them as well that there's not only one solution, you know, that there's not necessarily, and I'm not talking about in a case of a moral decision here, but perhaps like there's lots of choices where there's not one way, you know, you could try that and okay, you did that and this messed up, but look, this was good. You know what I mean? To sort of show them sometimes things aren't always clear, and they did well to sort of guide themselves, even though there were some blunders, and, you know, well done, you did really well, even, and you tried to fix that up, and you do you know what I mean? There's not just one solution.
I think that's a really good point, because I mean, we're talking here about voluntarism, but another thing you have is what we call, you know, I suppose it's like a intellectualism, and I'll give you a reading about that this afternoon, but it's kind of that approach that says, instead of relying on willpower, it's relying on the intellect. It's kind of like, I can think my way through anything. If I think about it enough, I will find the right answer and know what to do, you know? And it's kind of, and I think that can sometimes fall into this thing of thinking there is one right answer, you know, and I can think my way to it. And sometimes there's not just one answer. And that can be actually quite scary, because, you know, you can't find your way to the security of going, there is one best thing. There are different ways of doing it, you know. It's another risk, I think, of just relying on your intellect all the time, instead of sort of taking other things into account, like how you feel about something. You know? You don't decide things purely on how you feel, but it is important to actually know how you feel about something, you know, to take that into account, if not to be led by it. So yeah, I think the positives we've got of voluntarism, I mean, say, well, there's the positive of things get done. Your duty gets done, you're reliable, you know. I think that's positive. It's clear, like you said, you know exactly what you need to do. Sounds good, but, you know, and he's faithful. And I think this is something that sometimes, you know, as good Catholics, we can kind of fall into, like, reducing our freedom to this a little bit. You know, I need to, what is the right thing to do? And then I do it. And I do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's good. It is good, you know, because I want to do what God wants. You know? That's good, but God wants more for us, if you like. Like you're saying, it's kind of a bit reductive. If we just work on that, he wants more than just this sense of do what I tell you, you know, of fulfill your duty and then you get a reward at the end. So I think some of the negatives of voluntarism are this one of that we do get tired, You know, it is exhausting, as you said, if you're just always doing something because it's your duty and your heart's just not involved in it, you know, if your feelings aren't engaged. And again, we can't always have our feelings engaged in something. There are some things we just find hard, you know, but many of the things we can, you know, if we do things, if we do things out of love. So you think, well, if I get, I don't know, if my husband brings me flowers on Fridays because it's in the roster, you know, he's got it diarized or something. Or if he thinks every week, oh, I'm going to bring you flowers, does it make a difference? You still get flowers, right? But when it's sort of this idea of thought or whatever, it enriches a relationship a lot more. So the same thing when we talk about that relationship with God, when there's that love, there's that thought, and it's not just, well, I'm doing this because you say that is the right thing to do and I want to do what you say. Okay? So it's this reduction. I think the other thing you pointed out that was really good is thinking about resentment sometimes that can start to build up. You know, that I do it, but what I have to do is just push down my emotions. Like, don't think about it. Okay? Don't think about it, just do it. So that's one way of doing it. We don't think about it. You know, I mean, I can be a little bit like that. You know, when someone asks me, how do you feel about something? I tell them what I think about it. And they go, well, I didn't ask you what you think about it. I asked you what you feel about it. And I have to go, oh, hang on, I don't know. I just have to check, you know. And that's because, you know, it's a more, different approach. But if we don't even know what we think about it, how we feel about something, we're kind of working without one of our engines, you know, that we have this whole emotional dynamism, which is not the leader, but it's got a great force in our life. You know, when you're really enthusiastic about something, you know, when you really see the value of something, you're committed to something, it is easier to do, even though you see the negative points and the costs, right? Even though there is difficulty. So it's this, you know, that God, he's offering us in a way freedom as a path to happiness, not just as a path to doing what we have to in order to then be happy in heaven. So I think, so the resentment's another thing that can build up when we're just doing things out of duty and we're, you know, not questioning, we haven't fully made it our own again. So I suppose that's something that goes with that love and that trust in God. Okay? I think that's one of the implications. The other big implication for moral voluntarism is that we can forget to rely on grace, on the grace of God. So we're just doing it on our own strength. And again, that can be quite discouraging, especially when we fail, because we haven't lived up to our own standards. You know, we've used all our means and we haven't made it. You know, whereas with grace, I've heard it compared to being like you're in a rowing boat. You know, you're in a boat and you're rowing and rowing and rowing, and it's really hard work and really slow. But then, like, Jesus gets into your boat and he puts up a sail. You can go a lot more easily, you know, in the same direction. So you have that help instead of just trying to rely on ourselves. I think again talked about the discouragement that can come with moral voluntarism, you know, when we're just relying on ourselves, because we think I should be able to do this, you know, I should be able to do this. And I think sometimes we have to realize, well, no, I need the grace of God. I can't do it by myself. And God doesn't expect me to do it by myself. Right? So sometimes we put expectations on ourselves that are actually not expectations God puts on us. You know? And that's another point of voluntarism in the Father's letter on freedom. He says, you know, sometimes we even impose duties on ourselves that are not real duties. You know, that we have a should, this expectation, I should be able to do this, or I have to do that thing, you know, and it has to be done. And if it's not done, I feel really bad about myself, whatever. So, well, sometimes freedom, there are some things that actually don't have to be done. And can we let them go? Are we able to let them go? You know, to make free decisions. It's like, I suppose even like you think of all the good things that you can do in society and in the church, and there's so many different things you can be involved in. You know, there's pro-life, there's all these different things. You can't be involved in all of them. Sometimes we have to make choices to think, well, okay, perhaps, well, first of all, what's the most urgent, but also where do my talents lie? You know, what do I have available? What, you know, where can I put myself? And we do that freely, you know, making those choices rather than thinking that we have to carry all these things, you know, on our own expectations. You know, sometimes you can have a lot of shoulds in your head, and I don't know if anyone's ever said this to you, but, you know, you go, I should be able to do this, or I should do that. And someone says, well, who said? And you're like, nobody, God, no. And you go, well, I put the should on myself because it's an expectation I have of myself that I should be at a certain level. Right? And that's not necessarily a true thing. Right? It's something that we are unable to accept our own limitations, our own defects. And okay, that's not the same thing. We work all our lives on trying to improve and all of that, but holiness is not perfectionism. Holiness is that struggle all the time. And we need to be able to accept, I suppose, the limitations that we have, realizing that God loves us with them. Right? So, or we think we'll have to be able to do these things to be worthy of God. So Luther kind of had this idea, if I do more and more devotions and things, I can be worthy of God's love because I'm so unworthy. And it took him a long time to work out, you can't make yourself worthy of God's love. That is completely gratuitous. We're never up to being worthy of that. And then he kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, sort of saying, well, in that case, all works are unimportant and we're just saved by grace. Saying, well, no, if you have grace, then you do the works. But, God's love for us is something that's gratuitous. And our response is out of love. So it's not about earning, a particular worthiness in front of God or, to earn God's attention or praise. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyone want to comment, object?
Can I just say something? I read that article about Viktor Frankl. I didn't know that he had to make the choice of whether to take off to the US with his young wife or to stay and accompany his parents.
Yes.
And I thought about that and I thought God could work with either choice. So either choice was neither morally right nor morally wrong, but just had different consequences. What do you think about that? I mean, because then I thought, well, actually, the choice should have been take off to the US with his young.
Yeah, exactly. But
that is, you're supposed to leave your parents.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the moral. If you're looking at, but then he was looking for signs, and he found a sign.
Yeah. I think. It's hard to judge without also knowing the people, like how able were his parents to cope without him? What was he relying on? Or even as part of the Jewish community, and people saying like someone was one of the chief rabbi in Rome during the war, who he converted to Christianity eventually, but he couldn't do it earlier because as a Jew, he was holding the Jewish community together, kind of thing, and to him that was just so fundamentally important. So yes, it's hard to judge someone else's, what someone else has to take into account. I know when I read that, I was like, well, what about your wife? Myself,
And I know it was after the fact, every retrospect, but I thought, well, hang on, no, his duty was to his wife first. In our understanding of it. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute, God, it was not a moral decision. Do you know what I mean? So he had complete freedom to choose either.
Yes.
And God would have been okay. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it was morally better or morally wrong.
Yeah. I see your point. I do see your point that sometimes it is up to us to make that decision. And I suppose that's when you pray and you kind of discern. And
there's just different consequences, and sometimes consequences are less bad.
Yeah. And it's like it's I find it so hard to put a judgment on a situation like that because it's so incomprehensible to me to be in that situation. You know what I mean? See what you would have to take into account and things. But yeah, it was that idea of we do want to know the will of God, because that's important when you love. You want to know, and because we trust God's wisdom. And that's why as well with voluntarism, often there is a trust there, which is a good thing. If I know the will of God, I am secure that I'm doing the right thing. I trust God, even though this seems difficult. So there, that can be a positive thing there. It's just, I think it can leave out those other elements of the heart. So, but the point you raise is a good one, because if we go on maybe to talk about something called the divine command theory. I don't know if you've heard of this. Let me say, he was kind of thinking design, and And sometimes we do have signs from God that we could do different things, you know. He says, well, how about this one? You know, like even, anyway. But other times there are choices that we can make. You know? But this is a theory called the divine command theory. And this theory, you know, because you're saying, you know, Viktor Frankl was trying to work out what was the right thing to do. So this is a question that came up for the ancient Greeks. So Plato talks about it. And it's a question that says, is something right because the gods say it's right? Or do the gods say it's right because it is right? Okay. Or something's good because, is it that something is good because God commands it? So God says, do this, and therefore it's good. Or does God command it because it is good? Do you get the difference? So, honor your father and mother. Okay, so honoring our father and mother is good because God tells us to do it, or does God tell us to come up to honor our father and mother because that's a good thing to do? So it was a question the ancient Greeks asked. It was a big question that came up in medieval philosophy, and the consequences of it come down today and to the way people see God and the moral life. So anyone got a view on whether A or A, but A or B?
Yeah, it says that.
So the answer is A. What do you think?
I think B.
B? Was that Pauline that said that? Oh, Tamara.
Tamara. Like the thing is good in itself, and therefore, well, our God anyway. I don't know what the ancient Greeks' gods might have been different, but yeah, I think the things that we are taught to do are because they are good things in themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And God tells us that. Why? Why does he tell them to us?
Because for us to be happy, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much, yeah. So, yeah. Anyone go for A?
I go for A.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think otherwise we don't have any judgment for ourselves, you know, because otherwise, like you said, we could end up doing everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as in God commands me to do this in my life because it is a good thing. I think, no, something's good because God's above, God is above goodness. God's above everything, you know, God's who decides what goodness is, I suppose, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And everything is good means I've got this huge panorama. What do I do? Now I have to look and see what God commands for me in my life. And things will be different for different people, you know, for somebody who's celibate, for somebody who's a mother, for somebody who's not married, there will be different things that are not commanded, but willed for each of us. And we have to tune into what God wants for us.
Yeah, vocation. Yeah.
But
what about something like the 10 Commandments?
But if I see leaving my husband is good, then I can talk myself into thinking that God commands it. Because husband is whatever. Do you know what I mean? I can see something, I can see stealing plants from the neighbours good because it would look better in my garden, and I think God I don't know. I think something is good is very subjective.
Have I told you my story about plant stealing?
Sorry?
I told you my story about plant stealing. No, where I live is really busy, and people actually have seen people pull plants out of your garden. They just come and dig them up right at the front door and walk off with them. And we were losing. I had a line of pot plants. I noticed my line was getting shorter and shorter. Like every day there was a pot plant less. And so someone saw a lady. I think she might have been Chinese, but anyway, so she was taking these pot plants. So they said, let's put a sign. So we put a sign in English saying, please don't steal the plants. And this girl said, I'm going to ask my friend to put it into Chinese for me. And she went to ask her friend, and her friend said, it's probably my mum. She does it all the time. So anyway, some people don't think it's a problem. But yeah, you're right. So I suppose with this question, when it was being asked, the question was like saying, well, when we refer to things like, is there an objective morality? You know, questions where we say like the 10 Commandments in a Christian context. Okay? So are the 10 Commandments, like, are those just a random list of things, if you like, that God puts together and they become good because God says, well, here's the list, you've got to do it. And that makes it right.
No, they're reflections of the natural law.
Uh-huh. So that's the difference in what comes in here, because we could say, well, actually, when God for our good, it actually does have some relationship to our nature and to happiness, to our flourishing, to what's going to actually help us. So what I suppose, if we have this idea there is a link between what God says and our human nature, that says, well, there is some way that we can have an insight into what is right and wrong. We can think about that. Right? We can look at the natural law, we can look at experience, we can learn, all those things. We can see how they can contribute to our happiness, to the way things work in society. If it's a random list that God puts together and imposes on us, then the effect of that, and this is something that some of the philosophers in the Middle Ages started to say, right? Because they denied there was a human nature, for instance. But this list, basically then what is it? It's nothing more than an arbitrary set of commands that God puts together and slaps down on us. So it doesn't necessarily relate to what is going to help us. It doesn't have a necessary connection with happiness, other than that there's an ultimate punishment or reward. But if you look at it like that, as God just putting 10 things together and saying, okay, I'm just coming out with a list of 10, and you've got to show me that you're obedient, okay, by living these things.
Ailish, sorry.
Yep.
Just to let
Who's
you
talking?
know.
5 minutes?
Lisa. Yeah, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so the problem with that is obviously morality becomes arbitrary. Okay, so I mean, one of the questions is, what if God changed his mind? He said, actually, adultery is fine. Go for your life. I've changed my mind. So it's arbitrary. There's no reason why God chose these 10 rules rather than any other set of rules. Okay? There's nothing about how they relate to us that has any meaning. It means that God, if he wanted to, could come up with some awful commands. It could be really abhorrent. It wouldn't matter. If the command said, okay, should put to death all blue-eyed babies, something like that. Well, that becomes good because God says so. Because there's no measure that relates to human nature or to, to how God has made us. It's arbitrary. Ultimately, it's empty because we can't, and we can't actually hope to understand right and wrong by ourselves. We can't actually do that. Our reason ceases having a role. Okay? All we can really do is get this list and then think about it in more depth and try and put it into practice. But we can't actually connect with this idea of why something might be right or wrong for us. Okay? All we're left with is the willpower thing. I'm going to put it into practice because this is my duty. Not because I think it's going to make me happy, not because I think it relates to goodness, okay? Not because I think this is part of living well as a human being. It's just doing this. So when you look at this in this way, what do the 10 commandments become? They become this set of restrictions that God has slapped down on us for no particular reason. So instead of seeing God as the giver of our freedom, someone who helps us to live our freedom better, God becomes someone who restricts our freedom. Says, well, now you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other thing. And the 10 commandments is just one more set of competing arbitrary moral codes. Okay? And so of course people will go, well, who are you to dump this morality on me? Okay? I can't see any reason for living it other than that you say your God said so. It's got no relationship to my life or to my happiness. Okay? So that obviously can be a problem. We start to see God as restricting our freedom. And living the commandments becomes a question, not this idea of growing in freedom or perfection or love, but of punishment and reward. It's whether you fulfill these commandments or not. That's what you're going to be judged on, whether you've done it or you haven't done it, because I said so. Okay? So there's some of the sort of consequences, I suppose, that people have kind of drawn out in thinking about this issue. And, the importance of being able to use our intellect in understanding the connection between the moral life and happiness, okay, and our nature as human beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, and I think it's also important then for forming children in freedom, in educating, in relation to rules. Again, I mean, sometimes you just got to go, well, because I said so. I don't know if you've seen the mum song. On YouTube, there's a thing called the mum song or the mom song. But it's everything a mother would say to her children in a 24-hour day in 2 minutes or something like that, or condensed to 90 seconds. and it's to the William Tell overture, you know, the one, and the key part at the end is why? And it says, because I said so, because I said so, because I said so, you know, because I'm the mum. Sometimes that has to be the answer, right? But we have to go beyond that, helping kids to learn how to think about things. So when you talked about responsibility and consequences, to think things through, you know, the relationship between the rule or the principle that's being suggested and the reason why that might be important, okay? So that you can actually decide that you want to do it, you understand. That makes sense? So
Yes.
maybe we'll finish. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send you the reading from, I'll send you 2 readings. I don't know that we'll use them both tomorrow, but one is from Jutta Bulgraf, which talks a bit about the intellect. So we'll probably use that on Thursday. And the other one is this one from Edward Sri about men, women, and the mystery of love. So if you want to have a look at those. Anything anyone wants to kind of say or ask or object to before we finish?
So which one it is? God commands it because it is good?
Sorry?
Which one of them is it?
A. No.
A.
The second one.
Both A.
The second one.
This, I know.
both
Second one.
A.
Yeah, I shall fix that. I know. I shall fix that for next week. It's an easy way out, isn't it? You go, hey. Yeah, the second one. The second one.
God commands it because it's
Yeah.
right. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So, do we say Hail Mary to finish?
Yes. Thank you.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you.
Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Mother Mary, our hope and our
Pray for us.
Pray for us.